Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here, and today I want to talk about the best stats for all classes in PvP come patch 7.7. Why 7.7? Well, we'll get some new augments, as you might have heard if you've seen one of my last videos. And with those augments, the stats that we can reach change a little bit. It has been a while since I made one of these videos, so I thought I'd give it an update. Of course, this one is focused on PvP, but if you want to play PvE, the main thing that will be different for you is that you must have 2700 accuracy on any spec that's not a tank or a heal, and otherwise you can use the same numbers for Alacrity from below and then put the rest into crit. Also, I'm assuming that you have all the companion bonuses from completing the first 2 chapters of the class stories. If you don't, then your stats will be off by 1%, and that matters more than you think in some cases. So talking a bit about the stats, first we have of course Alacrity, shortens your cast and your channel times and reduces the global cooldown, which normally takes 1.5 seconds. So in most classes you want to run a little bit more than 2054 Alacrity, which is the breakpoint after which your global cooldowns will be 1.4 seconds. Of course there are 3 classes that get a passive Alacrity bonus from the combat style tree. Carnage and Arsenal get 3% Alacrity bonus passively, meaning they only need 1123 Alacrity to reach the 1.4 GCD, and Lightning gets a 5% boost from the combat style tree, so they only need 560 to reach the 1.4 breakpoint. Or, and this is what I recommend now, you can go for the 1.3 GCD breakpoint and put the rest into crit. One note about Alacrity is that in PvP you can not always expect to have perfect uptime as maybe in a PvE boss fight, so you can't always make use of the extra casts that the higher Alacrity value gives you. And in general, the shorter the fight, the worse Alacrity becomes compared to crit, for example. So if you only play arenas, maybe don't go for the higher Alacrity. Next, I want to talk about accuracy. And for accuracy, there are 2 main breakpoints. On some of the specs, I recommend that you run 5% extra accuracy, which is about 1100 accuracy rating. And then for PvE and for some classes in PvP, I think with the new augments, I will recommend that you run 10%, which is anything more than 2694 rating. In PvP only, you can also run 0%. And I recommend that for specs where 60-70% of your damage comes from force or tech abilities, aka yellow damage, which is not affected by accuracy in PvP. That is very important to know. So if you play one of these yellow damage specs, such as Concealment or Sorcerer, you want to put exactly 0 into accuracy, as otherwise you will waste it. And then finally, you want to put the rest of your stats into critical. But with the new augments, we will have so many stats that even that rest might slightly push you past the point of diminishing returns. What does that mean? Basically, diminishing returns simply means that the second point you invest into critical rating will give you a little bit less critical chance than the first one. And this is why you don't simply want to stack 8000 crit, because as you add more and more gear pieces with crit on it, each additional gear piece will give you a little bit less critical chance than the previous one. Now, when people talk about diminishing returns, sometimes they talk about it like there's some magical boundary that you should not cross. And in fact, that is not the case. Because when you look at diminishing returns, basically what you want to see or what you want to know is at which point does an additional gear piece with crit, or in our case an augment, give you less DPS increase than, for example, an augment with mastery. So concretely, that means once you reach around 4700 crit on a spec like Advanced Prototype PowerTech, adding another versatile augment with mastery might give you more DPS in some cases than adding another crit augment, because you already have so much crit. Okay, now a little caveat, these ideal crit values are usually calculated by PvEers using more or less static PvE rotations, which is used for boss DPS. But in PvP, first of all, you will not use a static rotation, and you can also do a lot more AoE in some cases. So the distribution of your damage through different abilities will not be the same as in PvE. And for example, if you have a class that has a talent or a passive that gives you extra critical damage on an AoE ability, it might be optimal to run a little bit more crit in PvP than it is in PvE. So when we look at the different specs, the first class here would be specs that run, I would say, a normal amount of Alacrity. So this is just enough to get you above that 1.4 GCD breakpoint. They don't have any special bonuses from the combat style tree, but they want to run 5% accuracy. So these are all specs that do like a mix of yellow and white damage. And that is because we want to run 5% accuracy. Now that's even true in the case of Hatred, which of course most of the Hatred damage comes from dots, which are yellow damage. But because of the tactical, so that's the 2x trouble tactical, a lot of your yellow damage actually depends on being triggered by a white damage attack. And with the new augments, I think you will have so many stats for crit that it can be worth it to run 5% accuracy also on hatred. And these are also all specs that really like critical. Deception, for example, has some very high critical strike damage bonuses. Hatred, of course, gets the reset on recklessness, which is triggered by crit. And then Rage and Fury have a lot of auto crits, which makes critical also very valuable. So I would recommend that you can even run a little bit more than 5k crit on those specs, especially with the next patch when we're going to have these nice new gold augments. Next, we have some specs that also like a lot of crit, but they don't need any accuracy because most of the damage or even all of the damage comes from yellow attacks. So those would be Conk Operative, Engineering Sniper, and Vengeance Juggernaut. On Vengeance, of course, you want to have as much crit as you can, because more crits means more resets on your Enrage, which means more slams, which means more crits, and so on and so on. Then we have a group of specs that are actually very similar to the ones above, but you can run them at a little bit lower crit, because they don't have quite these crazy crit bonuses that, for example, the specs above have. And those would be AP, Pyro, and so on. And also the tanks are in this category. So if you're running somewhere around 4.7, 4.8k crit and put the rest into mastery, I think that should be good. But in any case, if you have a little bit more or a little bit less crit than that, it is not the end of the world. One important note is that tanks get 10% accuracy passively. So in no case do you want to run accuracy when you're playing a tank in PvP. Next, we have Madness and the Healers, which are all specs that don't need accuracy for the reasons I already mentioned. They do like critical, but the main thing about these specs is that they can run a bit more Alacrity, because Alacrity just makes your casts complete a bit faster, and all of these specs are going to spend quite a lot of time casting. So 2842 Alacrity is something you can run, and you will still have enough stats for 4.8k crit. Next is Virulence, which is in kind of a unique spot because it is a spec where honestly some extra Alacrity just feels good. Something that was recommended to me by Wuss. I think he even plays with 3k or a little bit more Alacrity. I also know that the PVEers run something around 2800 Alacrity. And I think it's because, I mean, it does make your dots tick faster, but then also on Virulence, a large part of your rotation is channeling Cull. And more Alacrity simply makes a channel complete a little bit faster. But then for Virulence, you have Weakening Blast, which is white damage. Cull itself is also white damage, so you do want a little bit of accuracy, which makes the spec kind of unique. But with the new augments, you can still have enough crit for 4.5k, which is still more than enough. So that's what I recommend running on Virulence. On these following specs, I mean, you could theoretically also run some more Alacrity if you wanted, but on Lethality, IO, Any, and so on, I personally would just go for the 1.4 GCD, run 5% accuracy, and then put the rest into crit. And now for the special cases, Lightning, of course, as I said, you get 5% Alacrity passive, which means that with only 3696 Alacrity, you can reduce your normal casts to a 1.3 second global. And when you pop Polarity Shift, you will actually go down to a 1.1 second cast. That's of course because Polarity Shift gives you an extra 20% Alacrity, so makes your casts look like you're speed hacking. You will still have enough crit to get to 4.4k, which is why I think now might finally be the patch to try out 1.3 GCD Lightning if you haven't already. And then next we have Arsenal and Carnage, which are also in a special place because they do get passive 3% Alacrity. So with only 1178 Alacrity rating, you can get to a 1.4 second global cooldown. But because both specs rely very heavily on white damage, with the next patch, you might even consider running something close to 10% accuracy. Now, the best combination I found with augments and pieces is a little bit below 10% accuracy, because the threshold is 2694. But to be honest, I wouldn't go for 2.8k. With the current PvP gear, it's just a bit awkward. So I think if you're running this, you will have something like 9.8, 9.9% accuracy, which means that you are almost guaranteed in most cases to hit your big crits. So for Arsenal, for example, the priming shot and the rail shot is really annoying when those miss. And even with a close to 10% accuracy with the new augments, you will have enough crit to still hit really hard, which wasn't necessarily the case in previous patches. And by the way, if you want to know exactly how many gear pieces, augments, and all of that other stuff you need to reach these stats, I made a little stat calculator right here. Link to this sheet will be, of course, in the description as always. And what you can do here is simply edit those yellow boxes. So let's say your class has 2 implants with Alacrity and none with crit. Then you can put in your gear pieces. So let's say you have 2 for Alacrity, And now the sheet will basically calculate that this brings you to 2,356 Alacrity, so already more than the required breakpoint. So we can play with this a little bit and see, for example, that the number that I recommend would be 2 Alacrity implants, 1 336 gear piece, and 2 of the new 318 augments to reach the Alacrity breakpoint. Now, if you don't have the new augments yet, you can simply click here, and this drop down will allow you to choose what augments you have. So if you only have the beginner augments, 296 for example, you will need, I think it's 3 instead of 2 Alacrity augments. The rest of the sheet works the same way. I hope it should be pretty self-explanatory. Please take care of the notes down here, because of course you cannot have more than 14 augments in total, and crystals still don't work in PvP. If you want to do the same thing for PvE, use this little calculator down here. Simply enter your numbers in the yellow cells, and then it will calculate the values that you will get for Alacrity, accuracy, and critical. So this is what I recommend in terms of stats for the next patch. If you have any questions about any of the classes or anything I talked about, leave it in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this one, please don't forget to leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.